In the shadow of modernity's mechanistic worldview, humanity finds itself profoundly alienated from the very nature that gave birth to it. Through the concept of the ontology of death, Hans Jonas explores the radical transformation in our understanding of existence that has shaped contemporary thought. The historical shift from a pan-vitalistic ontology, where life was the fundamental ground of all being, to a modern ontology where death is the ground of the living. In its modern existence, humanity is vulnerable. The project it throws itself into can fail, and it will one day, and can at any moment, be extinguished by a blind and indifferent nature that has brought it forth, but has then adopted it away to a foster home where Samuel Beckett's endgame unfolds. Humanity's only connection to nature is through its own process of aging and decay. Human beings are over-equipped and suffer under a metaphysical melancholic clarity of vision. As a thinking reed, he is no part of the sum, not belonging to it, but radically different, incommensurable. For the res extensa does not think, so Descartes had taught, and nature is nothing but res extensa, body, matter, external magnitude. If nature crushes the reed, it does so unthinkingly, whereas the reed, man, even while crushed, is aware of being crushed. Humanity does not think with nature, but against it. Why is this foul-smelling yellow fluid running out of me? Why don't these growths on my fingers stop growing? Why the hell do I have 10 fingers and not 12? What are these two black holes staring back at me in the mirror? Humanity is truly alienated. And this alienation is confirmed every time it carries out a slightly too incautious act of reflection. The cosmos has been replaced by outer space, a smooth cell in which one constantly wakes up after a night of drinking that has been forgotten. Humanity has blacked out. Since nature is indifferent, it is also purposeless. And humanity cannot dig into its representatives, the living, to produce something that can sanction meaning. Everything falls back on humanity, and it falls through cities of ruin. Unfortunately, the fall itself also falls. Meaning does not exist, because one cannot find it, but only impose it. As functions of the will, ends are solely my own creation. Will replaces vision. Temporality of the act outs the eternity of the good in itself. This is the Nietzschean phase of the situation in which European nihilism breaks the surface. Now man is alone with himself. Jonas traces the nihilism that underlies modernity in general, and parts of the early Heidegger's thinking in particular, to a dualism that is only apparently dualistic. In reality, it is monistic. When humanity gained the ability to look at the world in order to interpret and understand it, it was not dead matter that met us. Life was everywhere, in affinity with us, self-evident. Humanity's soul, the very feeling of life, saw itself in everything. The early human being's life world largely supported this animism. In the jungle, in the forest, by the lake, life bubbled up everywhere on the horizon. What the modern human being regards as inanimate was, in this life world, alive, because the elements participated in the familiar dynamics of life. Through its care, water would wash down and end drought, but it could also transform into a wave that destroyed everything around it. before later dripping drops down into the earth again, which then became fertile soil. The early human being's life world enclosed the perspectival truth. Within this perspective, where the living frolics and returns again and again, life could not possibly be considered a marginal phenomenon. Only a shift in perspective can displace truth. Through the Copernican revolution, an interplay occurred between technological innovations and new vantage points. The horizon was expanded, and life was dispersed. Suddenly, life became an appendage to a small sphere in the vast dark void. From this so-called primitive worldview arises the original riddle, the first problem, death, life's self-contradiction. At this stage in human history, there are no theories, no systematic cosmologies. The ontology of life is therefore not a paradigm in Kuhn's sense, but rather an episteme as formulated by Foucault. In any given culture and at any given moment, there is always only one episteme that defines the conditions of possibility of all knowledge, whether expressed in a theory or silently invested in a practice. The ontology of life makes itself known silently through burial rituals in which the deceased is buried together with cherished objects that accompany them on the journey ahead. Since life is the episteme from which everything is explained, death, life's negation, must be assimilated into life. Life is the natural, death is the unnatural. In other words, death is not real. Thus there is no rupture. The dead bodies continue their existence in the afterlife. This is the paradox. Precisely the importance of the tombs in the beginnings of mankind, the power of the death motif in the beginnings of human thought, testify to the greater power of the universal life motif as their sustaining ground. Being was intelligible only as living, and the divine constancy of being could be understood only as the constancy of life, even beyond death and in defiance of its apparent verdict. The very moment life leaves the body belongs to the dead. The lamps, the suitcases, the rugs, the doorknobs, the windows. The fields, the marshes, the streams, the mountains, the clouds, the sky. None of this is foreign to us. We are continuously surrounded by the objects and phenomena of the dead world. In the period between our pan-vitalistic past and the situation that makes it possible for Karl Ove Knausgård to write these sentences, a tremendous shift in the view of nature has taken place. Jonas traces this situation back to the Renaissance and the formation of the mechanistic worldview. A vitalistic monism has been replaced by a materialistic monism, and the condition of possibility for the latter is a dualism rooted in humanity's experience of its own mortality. Life, as the only thing intelligible, is continuously forced to contemplate its own opposite when faced with a corpse. The anxiety this creates and the pre-articulated unconsciousness that this is not really alive, this is not me as a living being but will become me, eventually reaches such intensity that a defense mechanism is formed in which the soul flees the body. The body as such is the grave of the soul, and bodily death is the latter's resurrection. Life dwells like a stranger in the flesh, which by its own nature, the nature of the corporeal, is nothing but corpse, seemingly alive by favour of the soul's passing presence in it. Only in death, relinquished by its alien visitor, does the body return to its original truth, and soul to hers. As a fugitive, the soul possesses a rich inner life. This simultaneously makes it possible for the world, nature, to be stripped of its inner life. All intrinsic striving, metaphysical meaning, and value are swallowed up by the human inner realm, only to be projected back onto nature. The corpse shows that matter can exist without spirit. Through the newly established dualism, one concludes from this experience that spirit can also exist without matter. Jonas calls the various conceptions of being that arise after this break post-dualistic. This can be understood as the situation in which a tentatively unified perspective seeks to derive an ontology on the basis of one of the other side of the break, that is, soul or matter, corresponding to idealism versus materialism. For Jonas, dualism is not a problem in the sense of an arbitrary violation of being that one can dissolve by highlighting its internal contradictions. Rather, it is the striving toward monism that is dangerous. Dualism is grounded in reality itself, but reality is dialectical. Since the perspective attempts to explain all of reality, yet reality is split in two, it must choose one side as the explanatory basis of the other. Within materialism, this manifests itself through the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, where the secondary qualities represent the soul, understood as a function of the primary qualities that represent the abandoned nature. Within idealism, it appears through the distinction between consciousness and appearance. Since reality interweaves the two separate spheres, any attempt to reduce an interwoven dialectical dualism into a partial monism will produce a contradiction that manifests itself as the hard problem of consciousness on the materialist side and as the Ding an Sicht on the idealist side. The body is both inside and outside. I touch the world and I am touched by the world. This actum makes clear that an ontic division of labor, in which science is developed regarding extended nature on one side while the structures of the mind are accounted for on the other, cannot be harmonized. Such an ontic division must presuppose that the prioritized object of study does not transcend itself. But this is precisely what the living body does in both directions. The body is extended and susceptible to influence, while at the same time it feels and wills. It reaches out on the basis of the inner, and has the inner shaken on the basis of the outer. The body is justified as an ontological starting point because one's own body appears as an immediate inside and outside within the same structure. Our own experience of this concrete two-sidedness forms the basis of an inference about the extended nature as also containing an inner horizon of the same kind. Through the aforementioned dualistic development, the extended is stripped of feeling and life. But since the body is undoubtedly also extended, it must be conceived either as the same as the rest of the extended, in which case it cannot be understood as living, or as a class of its own, which breaks down the entire materialist explanatory model. On the idealist side, the mind is also abandoned as pure interiority, and the body belongs to the mind, either as one of consciousness' external ideas, which means the body as an extension of me, reaching out into the world is not understood, or the body can be understood as the extension of the inner, not as an idea, but then the idealist explanatory model breaks down. The living body that can die, that has world and itself belongs to the world, that feels and itself can be felt, whose outward form is organism and causality, and whose inward form is selfhood and finality. This body is the memento of the still unsolved question of ontology. What is being? and must be the canon of coming attempts to solve it. These attempts must move beyond the partial abstractions, body and soul, extension and thought, and the like, toward the hidden ground of their unity, and thus strive for an integral monism on a plane above the solidified alternatives. Jonas alternates between the terms post-dualistic and monistic to describe the new worldview. One way to understand this is to think of idealism as an epiphenomenon based on materialism, because a world that has been objectified into pure extended exteriority sidelines a pure consciousness that does not participate in its functions, that does not act in it but merely contemplates it. At the same time, this bodiless contemplator, through its separation, constitutes a world that, like itself, consists of parts separated from another, parts extra parts. Through this mutual separation, both consciousness and the world die, and the ontology of death takes over as an episteme that sets the framework for what can constitute truth within modern science. The model is pure matter, lifeless masses and forces operating according to laws that describe quantitative distribution in space. Such a picture could not have been painted unless reality had been stripped of life. This is why Jonas describes the modern worldview as the ontology of death, rather than, for example, the ontology of matter. Something has died. The ontology of death demands a reduction of reality down to pure extension that can be measured. Reality becomes mathematized, and the measurable alone satisfies the criteria for what can be called real. This means that the lifeless has become the knowable par excellence, and is for that reason also considered the true and only foundation of reality. It is the natural as well as the original state of things, not only in terms of relative quantity, but also in terms of ontological genuineness. Now it is life that must be explained within a mechanistic universe. In the same way that death was assimilated into life in our pan-vitalistic past, life is now assimilated into death. Life can only be explained through the models and categories of death, which manifests itself in mechanistic theories concerning the organism. The feelings driving life can appear as an anonymous pizza delivery boy for the genes in Dawkins' sense. Within the ontology of death, the problem of life is reduced to the question of the organism. Here the extended and the thinking meet, but since the organism, through its extended half, is part of the world, it cannot be distinguished from the world, from the rest of the world's being. For this homogeneity to be constituted, either the general, the world, must be seen in the particular, the organism, or vice versa. But since the world is already determined as lifeless matter in space, a successful explanation of the organism is achieved when it is reduced to the general lifeless. Jonas finds a similar dualism in Gnosticism. The Gnostic movement arose in several places and took many different forms, but a common feature is a fundamental dualistic mood. This dualism can be described as double, in the sense that humanity is separated from the world, while the world is separated from God. But it possesses a unity based on the fact that the relation, or lack thereof, between human and world mirrors the relation between human and God. Here, humanity and God belong together in a common front against the world, but are at the same time separated by the world. Jonas traces this theological superstructure back to a fundamental experience in which humanity feels alienated from the world through a decisive rupture. The theological superstructure here becomes the form of the human chorus of lament, which sings forth a God, the true God, who is completely alien to the world. a world that does not indicate him, and which therefore cannot be understood through any earthly analogies. The world does not indicate God because it was not created by God, but rather by a lower principle that it must necessarily follow the base laws of. Humanity's true self, pneuma, not psyche, does not belong in the world, but is, like God, completely transcendent and unknown. The stranger who does not know the ways of the foreign land wanders about lost. If he learns its ways too well, he forgets that he is a stranger and gets lost in a different sense by succumbing to the lure of the alien world and becoming estranged from his own origin. The demiurge shares with God only the power to act, but without knowledge or benevolence, in other words, blindly. The world, nature, is therefore a manifestation of blind will. The world is incomprehensible, a cruel relief to humanity's essence as gnosis. Humanity possesses knowledge of God and the self, but since the object of knowledge are not of this world, humanity is abandoned and alienated. The world is still a cosmos, but it is not in symbiosis with humanity through logos. It is exclusively oppressive, freedom-depriving and fate-determining. This abandonment manifests itself in horror, anxiety. But anxiety is simultaneously positive in the sense that it awakens humanity from an absorbed immersion in the world. Humanity finds itself, and what it finds is an executor of cosmic fate. The self must escape, but it cannot escape into amor fati because the fate is not its own. The self must attain itself, but can only do so by intensifying its alienation from the world. The world, not the alienation from it, must be overcome, and the world degraded to a power system can only be overcome through power. Within the gnostic situation, there is a breakdown of the classical doctrine of whole and part, where the whole is understood as the meaning constituting ground for the parts. The polis is a whole in which citizens find their meaning through dependence on the whole, while at the same time being conscious that they participate in maintaining the whole through their presence in it. The dissolution of the Greek city-states changed the material basis for this conception, but the principle was carried forward, with the difference that the citizens of the polis now became a citizen of the world and had to identify with the laws of the universe. These laws also include the individual citizen, so that action becomes synonymous with the unfolding of fate. Life becomes a stage where the citizen's earlier function vis-à-vis the polis has been replaced by a role in which one plays as if one is acting out of choice and that the action means something in a larger context. The aspiration of the Gnostic individual was not to act a part in this whole, but, in existentialist parlance, to exist authentically. If, with Heidegger, we understand God is dead as the proclamation of a development in which the supersensory has lost its vitalizing power, where the realm of ideas and ideals no longer exists, and contrast it with Gnosticism, we see that the unknown God does not correspond to the total absence of a supersensory realm where binding values can rule. God still lives, but his kingdom stands in no positive relation to the world. A transcendence withdrawn from any normative relation to the world is equal to a transcendence which has lost its effective force. Just as Sartre does not find any signs in the world that can bind him to action, the unknown God's laws are not intended for this world. Since there are no supersensory binding rules for the modern existentialist human being, we are forced to take freedom upon ourselves, without a compass, a groundlessness, a fall that falls, a feeling of horror that forces itself upon us. For the Gnostic human being, all forms of moral codes represent a psychic appendage to the physical laws of the world, and thus become a restriction on freedom. The authentic freedom of the self does not come through the soul, psyche, For it is determined by the moral law just as the body is by the physical law, but through spirit, pneuma, which is alien to the world. Humanity as soul is connected to nature and can, for example, be called the rational animal, but this belonging to the genus animal does not determine humanity as spirit. In Letter on Humanism, Heidegger points out that the classical definition of man as the rational animal places man within the genus animal, and that this places man too low. Jonas points out here that animal in the Greek sense does not mean beast, but animated being. In reality, the lowering to Heidegger consists in placing man in any scale, that is, in a context of nature as such. Dasein as self-projecting existence, which in the face of its future annihilation is individualized into entering authentic projects, has no nature that can bind existence to action. What is essential is to choose, not what one chooses. Through anxiety I find myself, but what I find is a scream to live, a scream that all living organisms carry forward. That which cries, I want to exist, is not you alone. It is everything, absolutely everything that has the slightest trace of consciousness. So that this desire in you is precisely that which is not individual but common to everything that exists, and indeed the reason why it exists.